Hello and welcome to M365 May and this session. My name's Cameron Dwyer. Like most of you, I'm bunkered down at home due to COVID, and I'm pretty happy to be able to communicate with the outside world through this session. So over the next hour, I'm going to be talking about one of the most recent technology developments around Microsoft Graph, and that is the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is squarely aimed at producing results or achieving results and getting access to your data that's stored in the Microsoft Cloud very, very quickly and with a very low learning curve associated to it. Before we get started, I'd just like to highlight that as part of this conference, we have a code of conduct and we take it very seriously. We want this conference to be a safe place where people can join, continue their learning path, and feel very safe in doing so. So I encourage you to visit the website and read our code of conduct. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this conference is being hosted. As we go through today, as part of the team's live event, you have the capability of posting questions to me as we go through the session. I'll hold off on answering those until the end, and we'll spend the time that we've got left at the end of this session trying to go through those questions. So I'm going to start right at the beginning and assume very little knowledge of Graph and development in general. I'm going to start with the story of Office. Back in 1990, we had the first version of Office, version 1.0 got released, and it was something that we installed on our desktop PCs. And Office was very much a product that got released in 3 yearly waves. So every 3 years we'd get a new version of Office. Its UI would look different, its features and functionality would change drastically, and we'd spend the next 3 years learning and mastering those features, training it to our users, and then that next wave would come along. The advent of the World Wide Web and cloud computing sort of changed the way that we deliver and deploy software. So that brought about Office 365. Which was the subscription-based version of Office. We also saw Office available online, just in a web browser, on phones, and it really changed the deployment methodology from being something that came around in 3 year waves to more ripples of functionality, which we would get under a much faster cadence to where we are today, where we really see updates happening to Office almost on a daily basis. And the Office application started off as those core productivity apps that we think of, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook. But as we've moved towards this cloud computing model and those products have become more tightly integrated and interconnected, we've seen this rebranding and this widening of what Office 365 is. And we're actually now terming it Microsoft 365. And it incorporates more than just those core applications. It also incorporates things like your identity management. Microsoft 365 now includes Windows 10 operating system as well. And also across the board, in order to use all of these applications in this cloud platform, we also need the security that goes along with it and the device management. So all of that is now encompassed under the brand of Microsoft 365. And really underpinning all of that and allowing Microsoft to deliver all of that is where we see the Microsoft Graph fitting. And pause for a little definition here of what the Microsoft Graph is. The Microsoft Graph is the Microsoft 365 data that describes the patterns of productivity, identity, and security in an organization accessed through a unified API endpoint. Now I want to take a second just to talk about the Microsoft 365 data piece of that statement. The Microsoft 365 data includes things that you would like files and things you would typically think about as data that you're storing up in the cloud. So these might be files that traditionally, before the cloud existed, you'd be storing on a network drive or on your laptop or your PC. So things like Word documents, Excel files, images. But the Microsoft 365 data that's stored up there in the graph is much more than just those files that you would typically think about. It's things like there's calendar invites, there's we're storing data about, well, who do you collaborate on documents with? Who have you had conversations and chat messages with? There's all of this sort of information that sits around the files themselves, and all of this data across all of those different applications that make up Microsoft 365 is all being stored up there in the Microsoft Graph, and it's available to us to utilize and gain more intelligence from. And the last piece of that statement, access through a unified API endpoint. Now, this is where we switch over. The Microsoft Graph is all of the data being held up in the Microsoft Cloud. And the Microsoft Graph API is our way of actually being able to get access to that data from the outside and query it and make changes. So we call it a unified API endpoint because the Microsoft Graph API it has the vision of being the one API to rule them all as far as Microsoft's concerned. So no longer will you have to learn an API if you want to talk to Exchange and get mail and calendar data, and a different API if you want to go to Active Directory and find out about your groups and your users, and another API again if you want to connect to SharePoint. The idea is that all of that data that Microsoft's holding for us will all be accessible through one API, and that API is the Graph API. So Microsoft Graph powers Microsoft products. Now this is a very important concept because what it means is the Graph and the Graph API isn't just an afterthought by Microsoft to enable third parties to get access to some of the data. No, instead it is core to Microsoft's own products. So what that means from a development point of view is that the Graph is robust. It's battle tested every day out there in the products that you use. So that means as a third party coming in and trying to access this data, we know that this is a robust API to be using. And the other thing from a development point of view is that there's examples of what the Graph can be used to do and what it can be used to power by just looking at those Microsoft products that you're using, because there's examples of the Graph API at play all throughout those products. One that you'll be very familiar with is trying to address an email in Outlook. As soon as you put your cursor in the to field, you'll be suggested people that you might want to address this email to. Now that's not just a random list of people. This is powered by the Graph API. This knows people that you've had recent interactions with, and it's suggesting that maybe you want to compose this email to those people. If I go further and I actually type in Jeremy, I get again presented with a list of people, but this isn't just all the Jeremys in my company listed alphabetically. These are the Jeremys that are closest to me based off my interactions that Microsoft 365 knows about. And because it's a unified API and it's being used throughout all of Microsoft's products, that same experience that I have in Outlook on the desktop, I also have on Outlook on my phone. And if I go into Teams and try and find Jeremy, you'll see that I get exactly the same Jeremys in exactly the same order presented to me. Or if I'm out in Word and I'm adding a comment to a document and I'm trying to mention somebody, I'll get those same list of Jeremys coming through. Now, the Graph API is what we call a people-centric API. It really has at its core, its center, is users. And around the users, we have all of those sort of files and artifacts that we're storing. And so we can see we have me at the middle, and then we have our conversations in Teams, our files in OneDrive, our tasks in Planner, our events in our calendar. But really what this allows us to do is it allows us to build up this graph of our whole organization, where you have a user at the center, and then you have all of the files and relationships around, and we can actually navigate and move. So we can have a look at me and my files, and then when we're looking at one of my files, I can see, oh, I'm collaborating on this with 2 other people. And then we move across to to that person, and we can see what they're working on. It allows us to form this entire graph of all the data and the people and the connections within our organization. But this isn't just a fluffy marketing term to make us feel all warm and happy that we're at the center of the universe. If we look at the actual API itself, if we try to call the Graph API, and there's examples of that on the screen here. If we look at the first one, find all events in my Outlook calendar. Now we call the Graph it's a RESTful API, so we call it by issuing sort of URLs, if you like. And that all starts with graph.microsoft.com. And that first one, if I use /me/events, that will give me back events in my calendar. The next example, if I wanted to create a folder in my OneDrive service, I can get to my OneDrive by using /me/drive. And the last example there, if I want to get a list of all the conference rooms in my building, I can just use /me/find rooms list, because the Graph knows about me, it knows what building I'm in, therefore it can find other rooms inside of that building. But as you can see, it's very much centered around me. So what data is actually in the Microsoft Graph? These are the super popular data sets that you would expect to be there. Mail, conversations, tasks, events, files, users and groups. But what you may not be aware of, because Microsoft's using this for its own first-party experiences as well, is there's hundreds, if not thousands, of data sets that are stored up there in the graph that you can be getting access to. And that leads us into our first demo, which is the Graph Explorer. Now, I'm going to be sending out links to the sites that I'm using in the demos at the end and making the slide decks available, so don't be too concerned about how I got to this page. But this is the Microsoft Graph Explorer. It's basically a web application hosted for you up on a URL, and you log in with your Office 365 identity, and you can then actually execute queries against the graph, and it will return live responses. So up here in the URL, up here, I've got an actual query, so graph.microsoft.com/me. If I run that, what it will do is it will actually make that call to the graph, and it returns data. As we can see down here, it's saying that my display name is Cameron Dwyer. It's showing my mail address and some other information that the graph is storing about me. So by using this tool, we can poke around and have a play to see what data is available within the graph and sort of try to get information coming back to us. And down the left-hand side here, we have sample queries. So I can click on this My Mail query. It's changed up the top here, so that now it says /me/messages. It's executed the query, and down the bottom, we're actually getting a list. This is a JSON formatted document that's coming back, and we're getting a list of all the mails that are currently sitting in my inbox. Now, what we can see on this page is a whole heap of properties. There is a subject down here somewhere buried in all of this. I'll see if I can highlight it. Oh, I'm going to highlight part of it. But there's a lot of other information about creation times and categories and receive times and dates and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean it up. Rather than bringing all of that information back, we can actually select certain properties we want to return, and we can filter information all through this URL. So if I just select the subject and execute that again, this time when the response comes back, it's much cleaner. And in between each one of these open and closed brackets, that represents an individual email. So now we're getting the subjects. Looks like the Office has been sending me some change notifications. And then we've got different subjects coming down here. So this is really showing me, we can see the first 5 emails there that are sitting in my mailbox. So super quick and easy to start interrogating the data that's inside your tenant. Another thing that I'll point out is beside these samples, there's actually a little link icon. If I was to actually click on that, that will take me over to the Microsoft Docs documentation on how to use these on that particular command. So here we're looking at mail, and this will take me through and give me examples of how I can query my mail, how I can query different folders within my inbox, and things like that. So it's great that it links straight into the documentation there. And one last example I wanted to show you very quickly was under SharePoint lists. So we can get more than just sort of that basic information around users and mail and calendar items. Here's going into SharePoint itself, and we can do that through the sites area of the graph. And here it's just returning all of the lists that exist in our root site collection. All right, so that's a bit of an overview of the Graph Explorer and how we can use that without standing up or writing a line of code to start interrogating the data that's stored inside of our Office 365 tenant. If anyone's interested in entering the competition that we're running to do some giveaways during the conference, then feel free to scan this code and enter that draw. There's a different competition running each week, and we've just begun week 3 of the competition. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to move along. And we've been talking about, up to this point in time, we're talking about what the graph is and the Graph API. But now I want to sort of position where the Microsoft Graph Toolkit fits in as a developer tool when you're trying to interact with the data that's inside the graph. So first off, we have that Graph API. But if you're trying to write an application that is powered by the graph and using that data, then there is a fair bit of code that you'd be writing, because you've got to issue the request out to the graph. You've got to take care of authentication and packaging up that authentication data and sending it off with the request. You've got to handle the sort of the response coming back from the Microsoft Graph and unpackaging this into objects. And there's more robust things as well. Like there can be, like, the internet is full of connectivity problems and things like that you would be needing to take care of within your application. And for some of those reasons, the Microsoft Graph, the Graph team has made available Graph SDKs. So these SDKs are language specific. So you have a particular Graph SDK for C#, you have another one for Java, you have one for JavaScript, and there's a few other languages that are supported as well. But what they're designed to do is they're designed to take care of those generic plumbing tasks when you're making calls to the Graph API. So things like doing authentication for you, making the requests and handling the response and retries if something goes wrong with connectivity, they're all packaged up into the Graph SDKs. So the idea is that if you want to make a call to the Graph, doing it with the Graph SDKs, you could do it in much fewer lines of code. But they've been out for several years now, the Graph SDKs. But the Graph Toolkit is the newest thing to be added from a development point of view, and that's the topic of this session. Where the Graph Toolkit comes into play is that it is built on top of those Graph SDKs, and it goes one step further. And that step further that it goes is that the Graph Toolkit is a collection of components, and these components not only include sort of binding to the graph to go and fetch data, but they also include the front-end UI associated with that as well. So this is going to allow us very, very simply and easily to put on a web page a whole unit of functionality that renders beautifully across devices. It's bound to data inside of the graph, so it can do all of the fetching of the data and present it for us. And that's how we describe the Graph Toolkit. It's described as a collection of framework-agnostic web components powered by Microsoft Graph. So we've got a few examples of it on the screen here. One of those is a login component. So just the ability to have a login button, the user clicks on it for it to go through that Microsoft sign-in process to take care of multi-factor authentication, if that's how you've got your environment set up, to allow the user to sign back out and see who they're signed in as. That people picker that we saw inside of Outlook, the toolkit allows us to use a people picker within our own applications and to have a similar look and feel to what the Microsoft native one has. And it's framework agnostic. What that means is that they are web components. So these components are only useful if you're building web applications, but they're framework agnostic, which means it doesn't matter if you're just creating a plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript page, or if you're using jQuery, or if you're using TypeScript, or if you've gone out to one of the full frameworks like Angular, React, or Vue, these components will work for you in all of those environments. Okay, we are going to build our very first graph-powered application, just to show you how simple and easy this is. So I've jumped into Visual Studio Code here, and let's go through this line by line, because I'm going to assume that you aren't all professional developers. So here, this is a standard HTML document. These first 3 lines of code are just telling us it's a HTML document, and it declares the head of the HTML document. And inside that, we insert one line of code, which loads in the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. You'll see this as we go through the code, this MGT, that stands for Microsoft Graph Toolkit. So we load this one JavaScript file in, and that's what makes the toolkit available to us within this page. And then inside the body, I'm actually going to remove 2 of these elements and make it even simpler. We've got 2 things added in here. Now these are elements, and I'm referencing them much like you would sort of this body tag or this head tag. So if we were to put a heading in here or a div or something like that, we would be referencing elements in exactly the same way. So these new ones, these ones starting with MGT, become available to us as soon as this script is loaded. Now before we can use the Graph Toolkit, we have to include this MSAL provider, or a provider of some sort. MSAL stands for Microsoft Authentication Library. And really what this is doing is it's giving our application that we're building here, it's just identifying it from a security perspective. So this client ID, there's one step that I'm not showing you in this session. I'm just doing it to save a bit of time. I can explain what it is that our application needs to have some sort of identity from a permissions perspective. And this is done out in Azure Active Directory. We have to register our application. And that's really just giving it sort of a name, who we are, what the application's about. And as part of that process, it generates a client ID, and that's what we're using here. So when a user comes in and tries to sign into the application, they know what they're signing into. Now, that client ID is a publicly accessible ID. There's no security problem here with me putting that client ID in there. There's other things at play here that make this secure. But that simply identifies our application to Azure Active Directory. And then we drop in this component from the toolkit, the login component. So let's save that. and I will just make that go live so we can see it in a web browser. And just by using those lines of code, it has been able to automatically sign me in here. This is our login control. Sign me in as Cameron Dwyer. I can see my email address. It's giving me the ability to sign out. It's actually automatically signed me in because in this browser session, I was already using the Graph Explorer. So that gets our login control. So usually when I talk to a developer audience, the first stumbling block they come to when they try to write an application using Microsoft 365 data is how do I do authentication? And it's traditionally been a very difficult topic to get across. But as you can see, that was super simple. All right, let's go and try and add some more components in. Now that we've logged in and we've got our identity, let's go and try and use a people picker. So you'll see just by adding that one element of code, I now have a type ahead people picker where I can look up people from my tenant and start adding them in. So really powerful, and I'm just doing this by adding an element to a HTML page, no different to sort of writing a blog post. Let's go for one more component because this one's got quite a lot of functionality to it. This is the tasks component. So this will show us information from our planner tasks that have been assigned to me. So here we go, this whole unit of functionality has just been dropped in by adding that one element. And this isn't just read only, I can change the status of these tasks by clicking on them. I can reassign them to other people within the organization. I can delete tasks, or I can go ahead and add a brand new task, select the plan that it's related to, the bucket that it lives in, its due date, assign people to it. I can do all of this, and this will physically go and create tasks and update those planners within my Office 365 tenant. So this is super powerful and like just so quick to get up and running with it. And this is totally secure. Like all of this isn't, there's no smoke and mirrors here. This is the entire application, just these few lines of code that we've been writing here. There is nothing else inside of this directory. This is all that, everything you see on the screen is powered just by these few lines of code. Okay, so what other components are available to us? So we've seen the login component. The person component allows us to see a visual of a person's face. The people allows us to see multiple people and have hover over cards that allow us to send email messages, start phone calls. We have a Teams channel picker, which allows us to see the teams we're a member of and the channels within those teams. We've got an agenda web part, which lets us see calendar entries. And we have the task web part, which we quickly saw as well. And one of the best ways to start playing with these components that are available in the toolkit is out on a website. And that website is the Graph Toolkit Playground. Again, I'll have links to this in a slide at the end of the session. We can see down the left-hand side here the different components that make up the toolkit. And if we select one of those, there's two tabs here. There's a canvas tab, which actually shows you a real-time rendition. So we can see the code on the right-hand side here, and we can play with that code. And then on the left-hand side, it will reflect any changes we make to it. So it's a playground where you can sort of poke around at the different components and see how they work. There's also a separate tab called Docs, and that describes different ways in which you can manipulate the component. So a lot of the components have different attributes you can apply to them. I'm going to play with a few of these here just to give you an idea. So here we've got this, we can see some more attributes have been added into this component. I'll remove a few of them, we'll see the effect that it has. So the agenda component by itself will just show entries off a calendar. And you can see here, we've got a few other attributes here. There's a date specified. It's actually showing events from a year ago, and days 3 is showing us 3 days worth of events starting on May the 7th, 2019. But as you can see, it's hard to tell where one day finishes and another day starts because they've just got times against them. So one of the other attributes that this component supports is this group by day. So all of a sudden now we have Tuesday, and then we have Wednesday, and then we have Thursday. Okay, so it's not just the default rendering that you get, you can actually modify it a bit as well. Another example of that is just the people one. The people, let me scroll up to the top of this page. The people component. So here it's just showing a list of people who are close to me on the graph. So this is very similar when we looked at Outlook and we just put our cursor in the field to address the email message, and it was just suggesting people close to me or that I've recently interacted with. So here we can just change the number of people that it's showing, and we'll see that it has a hover over card here, so I can start a chat message, send an email, start a phone call, see more information about that user. If you're building your own application, you probably want a bit more control over the people that were being shown, more than just insights from the graph. So another thing you can do with this component is if you can specify the user IDs of the people you want to see. So here we've listed the ID of 3 different users, and that's the 3 users that are shown over here. So you could see this could be quite powerful in an application if you were having sort of events or items inside of your application and you knew the users that were responsible for those items or events. You could have a very rich UI very, very quickly by using this component. Okay, so one thing that I'm often skeptical about when I look at pieces of technology like this Graph Toolkit, because it promises so much with such little input, really. I tend to get skeptical that it's going to lock me in some fashion. Like, what happens if the business has got a requirement and I can see that this toolkit is going to be able to deliver on that requirement very, very quickly without much effort? So that's great. I'll use this to new technology. But then once you've delivered the business requirement, the business comes back and says to you, well, this is great, it fits our requirement, but really I just want that to be a slightly different color. Can we make that blue instead of red? And now that we can see the information that's coming back, I'd really just like these other 2 properties of information. If you could deliver that, it'd be absolutely perfect. And then as a developer, you're in this situation where you were able to develop sort of 95% of what the business wanted really, really quickly without having to write much code. But now all of a sudden, you could quite easily be locked in and thinking, well, the component doesn't do that. And because I haven't developed any of it to fit that new requirement, I'm going to have to go back to scratch and develop this whole thing myself. And I've got a mammoth job in front of me. So I like to look at this toolkit and have a look at, well, how is it going to avoid poor developers getting stuck in this trap? And I'm happy to say there's a few areas inside of the Graph Toolkit that help us avoid this situation. The first 2 are around the visual elements. So the first one's custom styling. So as far as colors go and things being blue or red or black, the toolkit is designed to be overwritten with custom style sheets and styling. So if you want to change the colors of things and the fonts, all of that can be done quite easily, and the toolkit is designed for that to happen to it. The second thing is what are called templates, custom templates. So when data comes back from the Microsoft Graph, the query gets executed, the data comes back. If we think about those planner tasks and that component we showed where we saw all those tasks coming back from planner, there is quite a bit of HTML that goes into each one of those items when it comes back from the graph. So there might be some different divs that are going in there, and it's positioning spans, and it's doing all this sort of, it's injecting dynamically all this HTML for each item that comes back. But these components are designed so that you can provide your own template. So if just styling with CSS isn't enough, you can actually provide your own HTML, which is stamped out for every one of the items that comes back. So you're still using the power of the component, but the component is allowing you to not use the default rendering and binding of the data to HTML elements, but you can provide your own. So that's really, really powerful to be able to override that entire display experience. And there's also 2 other components I'm going to discuss in a little more detail here, which allow us to use a lot of the power that's in the toolkit without having to fall back and redevelop things ourselves. So the first one I'll talk about is MGT get component. Now this one's vastly different to any of the other components in the toolkit. And the reason it's different is that, first of all, it's not bound to a particular data set within the graph. So if you think about tasks, well, that's really bound to planner and getting tasks out of planner. If you think about the people picker, it's bound to groups and users. But the MGT get component isn't bound to any data at all. The idea is that you have to specify what data you want to go and fetch out of the graph. So that's awesomely powerful because it means that you can get access to any data set that's within the graph, even if there's not a toolkit component built yet that's purpose built for hitting that data set. And the way you do that is in the first line of this code example here, you can see the resource attribute, and I've got /me/messages in there. So what that's going to do is that's going to go off and get my email. That's the same query as what we were using in my first demonstration. We looked at the Graph Explorer. And in fact, that's how I do development against this. I go into the Graph Explorer, I poke around in the Graph Explorer to try and find the data that I'm looking for inside of Graph. And once I've got the data coming back, I can use one of these MGT get components to go and retrieve that data for me. So here we're using /me/messages, so it's going to get my email messages. The scopes is the permission that the user needs to consent to for me to go and get those messages. So in this instance, it's mail.read. Now the Graph Toolkit, this is a great thing about the Graph Toolkit, is it includes all of the logic that if a user hasn't consented for my application to go and read their mail, it will pop up a nice dialog. It'll say, hey, this application wants to go and read your mail. Do you give it consent to do that? If they click yes, then off it goes and gets the data. Now, once that query has been executed, there's a few things that are at play here, and they're called templates. Now, this is around that, we sort of mentioned it briefly when I said you could override the default templates that some of the other components use. In the case of MGT get, there is no default template. Because it's not bound to any particular data set inside the graph, it does not know how to render it. So that's the other critical part we need to specify for MGT get. We need to specify, first of all, that resource to go and query, and then when the results come back, we need to specify, well, how are we going to display this? And that's what this template data type value does. I'll quickly touch on it. There's 3 different templates here. There's template data type value, and then there's 2 more, template data type loading and template data type error. The loading one is simply what HTML do you want to display while the query is being executed. So we could, here I'm just putting the word loaded, but you could put a spinner in here or whatever HTML you would like while the loading is going on. And if an error occurred, so maybe the user doesn't consent to read my mail and they hear, no, I don't give access, then an error would come back. And here you can put HTML in to show in an error condition. And you can get the message of the actual error itself to display to the user. Okay, so let's go back up to where we actually get our value coming back. So we would get a list of email messages coming back from the graph. Now it will repeat this template for every item in the list. So every email would stamp out a div, and I'm putting a class here just for styling. And then we can grab the properties off that object coming back. So we can grab the subject off the email message, and it will do that for each one of the email messages returned from the call. So quite easily, we could use an MGT get component to build up email messages that are in our inbox. Here, we're showing a little bit more than just the subject, which is shown in bold. We're also using the preview of the email message, which is just an attribute that comes back, and who the email message is from. So maybe with 2 more lines of code, we would get an output that looks like this. The other get out of jail free card, as far as locking goes with the Graph API, is the ability to move back down the stack to use the Graph SDK itself. So let's say there was something we wanted to do with the Graph Toolkit that Graph Toolkit just didn't give us access to do. What we could do is, rather than have to rewrite the application from scratch, is that because the Graph Toolkit is built on top of the Graph SDK, there is actually an SDK behind the scenes. As soon as we included that JavaScript for the Graph Toolkit library onto our page, the Graph Toolkit sets up a Graph SDK client behind the scenes, and we're not aware of it, but we can get access to it. And they're called providers. So that's exactly what this code does here. So what it's doing, this is a bit of JavaScript code, and providers is something that is made available to us through the Graph Toolkit, and we can get the global provider. This code is just making sure the global provider exists. And then out of the provider, we're getting the Graph client. Once we get a handle on that Graph client, we're now stepped down a level in the stack, and we've now got the full power of the Graph SDK client. But what's great is we don't have to initialize it. The Graph Toolkit did it for us. We don't have to worry about authentication, because the login component will have taken care of the authentication for us. We can just simply start making calls down at the SDK level. And I'll show an actual live demo of that in a moment. In fact, we're going to dive into it right now. Okay, so we're going to start this demo. Up for it. While that's loading up, this demo out in SharePoint. So in the next 10 minutes, we're going to build a fully fledged application And we're going to cut very few corners on this one, actually, and I hope it resonates just how powerful this toolkit is. So imagine we are a product company, Chemtoso. We sell clothing and apparel and sporting goods. And this is just a SharePoint team site. And what happens is customers buy stuff online, orders come through into this list in SharePoint. See, here's just order numbers, status. We've got a couple of things that are ready for packing, one that's not quite ready yet, addresses of where we've got to ship it off to, total number of items, order manifest, and contact of who's made the order. Now, we've got packers that are actually down in our warehouse. Now, these are the people that are responsible for physically going around the warehouse floor, finding the goods that need to be packed, putting them into a box, and then taping the box up, ready for it to be packed and ready for it to be delivered. Now, our warehouse workers need a lightweight way of seeing what orders have come in, what needs to be put inside of that box. So we're going to give them a dedicated app that just gives them a picking list of orders. So they can see all the orders that are ready and what they need to pick from the different boxes to put in. So to do that, we are going to create a HTML web application using the Graph Toolkit. So let's jump out into Visual Studio Code. Not that one, that was our first example. We want this one. Let me do a window shuffle here for you. Okay, now this one has a little bit more code to it, but we're going to step through this very, very slowly, and it's not vastly different from our first example that we went through. Okay, so the code that's in green is currently commented out, which means it won't execute when we run it. And we're just going to walk through it here. So again, this is just a single HTML page to this application. There's no other files going on. There's no other magic outside of this one file. Now we've got our HTML document, we've got the head declared, and we've got that script line loading in our Microsoft Graph Toolkit. So at this stage, no different to our first example. Then we're down into the body of the document. We can see we've got this MSAL provider, which is identifying our application for when the user goes to give consent. They know what application they're consenting to. And we've got the login component, which we saw in our first example as well. So down to here, this is just identical to our first example where we had our login component. So now we're down to, let's use some of these other components. And this whole section here is the MGT get component, just as we saw in the PowerPoint presentation. So what we're going to use this MGT get for is we're going to use it to go and get those items out of SharePoint, because there is no component in the toolkit for querying SharePoint items, but we can use the MGT get component to do that. And the way we do that is we need to specify that data set that we want to go and fetch. Now, this is exactly the same query as I could execute in the Graph Explorer. And in fact, that's how I came up with this query. So I used the Graph Explorer until I got the data that I wanted, and then I pasted it in here. But let's walk through what this is doing. So it's calling the Graph endpoint, obviously, the Graph API. And then the SharePoint data is available under the sites area of the graph. And then we have to tell it what site. So this is our domain, chemtoso.sharepoint.com. And then it's not the root site that I want to go to, but it's another site collection, which I can find under the URL /sites/warehouse. And then we want the list items. So inside of a SharePoint site, we can just say /lists to navigate to our lists. And this is the specific list ID of that orders list that we were just viewing in the browser. Once we get to that list, we want to actually get to the items inside of that list. So we can go /items to get a handle on the items. And then for each of the items in that list, I want to be returned all of the values for the different columns, the SharePoint columns, because we're going to display some of those to our little packing app. And the last thing I want to do is I don't want all of the items that are in that list. I only want the ones that are ready for packing. And I can apply a filter based on any of the columns that are in that SharePoint list. In this case, I'm going to filter on the status column and just look for ones that are ready for packing. Okay, so that's one very long query. But keep in mind that that query is querying just an arbitrary thing anywhere inside of a Microsoft 365 tenant. But we've been able to, in one query, specify all the way down to a subset of items in one list in SharePoint. We've got a scopes here, which is telling us that we need the ability to read SharePoint sites that the user's got access to. So again, they'll be asked to consent to that. And now one of very interesting other attribute that's in here that we're going to make use of. You don't have to specify this. If we didn't, what would happen is the page would load up, it would query SharePoint once, and the data would be returned. But what the MGT get allows you to do is it allows you to specify a polling rate. Now the polling rate will periodically go back and re-query, execute this exact same query again. And if the data set has changed, it will re-render just to show those new items. So the reason I want to do this is I want the warehouse worker, the picker, to be able to just have this application open on a device, on a mobile device, and walk around the floor. And if new orders come in, they don't have to hit the refresh button or anything in the browser. They can just have it open. It will automatically pop new orders in as they come through. Okay, so that's the query part of the MGT get, and then we've got those templates. So this first template is the value ones. This is what we're going to do for every one of the SharePoint items that is returned by the query. Now we're putting an outer div around them here just for styling. I'm going to call that the order. And then within each order, I've got a header, a body, and a footer. The header is going to include the title of the order, so that's the order number. It's going to include the contact name that the order's for. The order manifest is each of the line items of what they've got to put in the box. And then I'm going to put the total number of items that should be in the box at the bottom, just as a visual reference so that they pack all the line items, and then at the end they can see that, oh, I should have 5 items in this box. And then the other 2 templates are our loading template, which is just, I'm just showing the text loading while that query is executing. And if there's an error, we're going to display the text of the error message. This bit's all commented out, so that's all we've got. That's our entire web page. So let's save that. And I'll hit go live so we can see it actually render in a browser. So we see our signing component. We see the loading text came up very, very quickly. And then here's our text coming back. So it's not styled very nice at the moment, but this is the actual data coming back from the SharePoint list. So this is the first one that I've got highlighted. And then we've got a second order coming through there as well. So we've got order Chem001 and Chem002. If we flick back to the SharePoint list, we can see Chem001 is ready for packing, Chem002 is ready for packing, and this Chem003, because it's in a status of requested, we aren't seeing it. So that looks great. It looks like our query is working. Now, you may not be able to see this on your screens, and I apologise because I haven't been able to find a way to zoom partially this screen whilst going through Teams. But it's not important to be able to read what's going out here. What this is doing is it's looking at the network traffic that's happening on this page in real time. What you'll be able to see is this is an actual query going out. This is what's fetching the data from the Microsoft Graph. Every 5 seconds, you'll see that a new request goes out. So that's that polling kicking in. And it's going to keep doing this every 5 seconds. And it will re-render this if the values have changed since the last time it polled. So it looks like that's all working for us, which is fantastic. So I'm going to return to the code. And I'm just going to do one thing quickly just to make this a lot easier for us to read, is I'm going to include a style sheet. Now, I'm far from the best styling guru, so this is only some very basic, a few lines of applying a style sheet. And that's turned each one of our orders now into a nice looking little card. So the warehouse picker can come in and they can see here clearly, okay, we've got 2 orders that I need to walk around the floor here and pick. As you can see, there's all of the line items and then there's a total item count at the bottom. So fantastic. And this is, I think we've got to take stock of what we've actually managed to build here. This is a standalone application. It's fully secured, backed by the security of Azure Active Directory. It's allowing a user to log in. If they've got multi-factor authentication, it will take them through all of that consent flow. It's now reading data dynamically from SharePoint. And if we actually go in here, and let's say that third item, let's say it's not requested anymore, let's change its status and say it's ready for packing. If I'm quick enough and I change back to our application, there it is. It's popped in because of that polling mechanism. So we've created a dynamic application that's making all these orders available for the users. And just in this current state, they could walk around with that on any device, and you'll see it sort of flows and it's nice. It doesn't matter what the screen size is. This thing will dynamically adjust itself. And so that's the bulk of our packing app has already been developed. But let's go one step further. Once they've packed the box, it'd be great if we could just click on a button and update that status back in SharePoint to say that the order's been packed. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll switch back to the code. In order to do that, we're going to add a button onto each one of those little cards. And that's what this line of code here will do for us. So here we've got a button, which is just a standard HTML element. And we're giving it a label mark as packed, because that's what's going to do when we click on it. And then we're going to call a function when we click on it. We're going to have to write this function in a moment, but let's just call this function at the moment, change status to packed, because that's what we want to do when they click on it. We want to change the status to packed. I'm going to pass in this, which is a reference to the button that they've just clicked. And I'm also going to pass in the ID. Now this ID is coming from the SharePoint item, because when we go back to SharePoint inside of this function to try and update its status, we're going to have to be able to get a handle on that SharePoint item. And that's where the ID will come into play. Okay, so that was pretty easy to create a button. Now here's the code that goes behind the button. Let me just comment this, uncomment this so we can see it. Okay. So before we write the code for our function, there is one thing that it will do. And this is using that the provider that we can get from the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, because updating a SharePoint item property isn't something we can do with one of the Microsoft Graph Toolkit components. So we have to step back and use the Graph SDK that the toolkit is using under the covers. And this is how easy it is to get access to that Graph client. So here we can just, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, the MGT, gives us access to this list of providers. And inside there, it has a global provider and the Graph client. So this is the Graph SDK client. Now it's been fully initialized and the Graph Toolkit is using this under the covers. It's just exposing it so we can use it too. And I've done that outside of the function because this first bit of script here, being outside of a function, this will load as the web page starts up, because we only need to grab that Graph client once, not every time they press the button. So now let's get into the function itself. So what does this function need to do? Well, since we've already got a handle on the Graph client up there, we can just ask the Graph client to execute an API call. And in this case, it's very similar in structure to when we went and tried to get all the list of items. So we're saying that we want to hit the sites area of the graph, and then we're giving it the path down to that warehouse site. Again, we're giving it the path into the list. This time, once we get to the list, we want to go /items to get to the items in the list. And then we want to provide the actual item ID that we want to update. So that's where we passed it in from here. We're passing in the item ID. When we click the button, it comes into this function, and then we insert it into part of our query. So items / the item ID, and then /fields, because it's a field that we want to update. And then in here, we add a scope in to say that in order to perform this operation, we'll actually need write access. We haven't asked for that in our application yet. So the first time the user uses this, they'll get prompted for consent to say, hey, do you allow this application to update a SharePoint item on your behalf? And then finally, we can actually call our update. And what do we want to update? We want to change the status to be packed. Okay. Now, I told you we weren't going to just be building a smoke and mirrors application. So I put one other line of code in here, which is this, the button that we clicked on. I'm going to change its styling class. I'm going to change it to be inactive because what will happen here, let's just take stock of what we're building. So we've got the MGT get component is going to be updating itself based on the status of the items inside of SharePoint. Once we click on this new button to mark it as packed, we'll be making a query off to the Microsoft Graph, which will update the category on that SharePoint item. But nothing at that point in time is going to remove that card from our HTML page. But what will remove it is because we've got that polling rate. Once the category gets changed on the item up in SharePoint, within 5 seconds, the query will get re-executed. And because that item will no longer match it because its category has changed, it should get removed from our HTML page for us. But what I wanted to do is there could be a lag there of up to 5 seconds from when we click the button. And I want the user to know that, well, we've actually done something when they click the button. So that's why I've got this line of code that's changing the class name to inactive. So what that's going to do is it's going to hide the button away as soon as they click it. And then within 5 seconds, the whole card should disappear. All right, let's save that. Our page in action. And then we see our button has come in now. So that's simply that button element that we added. And when we click on it, it should execute our method. So let's try and mark that first order as packed. We've run around the warehouse floor. We've thrown in some swimming goggles, a couple of swimming caps, a pair of flippers, 5 items in the box. Yep, 5 items, awesome, packed. So the button disappears, and then within 5 seconds, it's gone. If we move back over to SharePoint and see what's happened, will you refresh this SharePoint page? We can see that our first order is now packed. Pretty cool, right? We've just completed the loop. and we've built our entire application. We can run around the warehouse, build that one, pack it, grab the glow sticks, grab the mesh glasses, grab a whistle, someone's up for a good night, hit mark as packed, and we're done. Within 5 seconds, it will requery SharePoint, and all of our packing's been done for the day. So that's pretty cool. I actually quite enjoy this. I think I could create a few more orders just to click them and watch them disappear. And at the end of the day, like, let's say this was a shared device down on the warehouse floor. At the end of the shift, I can simply sign out. I'm going to sign out of Camtoso. And if this was a shared device, we've just securely logged out so no one else can access it as us. It's ready to be signed in again on the next day. We haven't actually seen the sign-in experience. If I just click sign in, here it goes, takes you through the standard Microsoft login experience. If you have MFA, it would go through all of that, and the next user could sign in the next day when their shift starts, and away they go. One thing I'll point that out, let me come back here just before we leave this demo, is that we've been able to achieve all of that in this demo. A secure standalone application accessing SharePoint data in real time, updating itself and staying in sync with what's happening inside of that SharePoint list. We've been able to then go back and update items within that SharePoint list. As I said, we've been able to do all of that securely. We've cut no corners. You're seeing the whole application, and you're actually seeing it on a screen here in 40 lines of code. And I think there's at least 4 lines of code I can see there that are actually blank lines, so I could illustrate different sections of it. And it's just incredible how powerful and how much functionality you can get in so few lines of code. All right. So why would you use the Graph Toolkit? I hope that it's been pretty evident as we've gone through this session why you would want to use it. You're going to cut your development time significantly by using the toolkit and without having to write all of this plumbing code yourself. The components that come with the toolkit are beautiful and they're flexible. They follow Microsoft designs guidelines. They're accessible. They work across all browsers and devices. And it doesn't matter what web framework that you're using, whether it's just plain HTML pages like I've used in my demonstrations today, or whether you're a React developer or an Angular developer, these components can be used inside of your projects. There's a few resources. Again, I'll make this slide deck available, so you'll have access to all of these different links. I would like to call out, so the bottom 3, the Graph Explorer, the Graph Toolkit, and the Graph Toolkit Playground, are sites that I visited during this session and shown you. The top one, a lap around Microsoft Graph Toolkit, is one I haven't mentioned. Now, this is a series of articles which are really taking a learner from knowing nothing about the Graph Toolkit and taking them through all the different aspects of the Graph Toolkit and the different capabilities of it. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in getting to know the Graph Toolkit, is a really, really good place to start. And in fact, that warehouse example, I created that warehouse example for this Graph Toolkit series of articles. So I've written some of the articles in that series. A huge thank you to our sponsors and the organisers of this conference. Like, it's amazing that they've been able to get this off the ground, and it's just not possible without sponsors behind it as well. And a lot of these names are companies that you will recognise that have been in this Microsoft 365 ecosystem for a long time, and it's great to see them getting behind events such as this. So I'd like to say a big thank you and go and check out their products and services. Okay, these are my details. If you'd like to connect with me and keep the conversation going beyond this session, I'm fairly active on Twitter on Cameron Dwyer. I have a blog at camerondwyer.com, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. And on that LinkedIn front, if you haven't discovered it already, as part of this conference, there is a Microsoft 365 May group where I'll be posting the slide deck, also be posting the link to the session recording. And we're about to go into Q&A, but if there's any questions that I won't have time to get to, I'll be answering those in this group as well. So please go become a member of that group, check it out, and let's continue the conversation over there. And with that, I'm going to ask Daryl, who has been kindly orchestrating this session behind the scenes, if there's any questions that have come in that I'll be able to answer in the time that we have remaining. And thank you very much for sticking with me through the session.
Well done, Cam. Like, there's been a few good comments too, saying great work. It's quite exciting stuff. Yeah, just to read off a couple of questions for you, so you can give some thought to it. When you post a call via this Graph Explorer and you're connected to a real tenancy, does it really post the data, or is it just simulating it?
Very good question. So that was the Graph Explorer website when you're poking around with a tenancy. It is if you're logged in with your Office 365 account, you are making real queries against the graph. So if you get information out, then it's pretty safe because you're just reading information. But if you post information or update information, it will really create data inside of your tenant. There is something I should mention about that Graph Explorer, and in fact, I can jump out there. If I go to that Graph Explorer, when you first come to this page, on the left-hand side here, you can see I've got a button to sign into the Graph Explorer. If you don't sign in at all, it will still let you execute queries against it. It won't let you do post queries to modify data, but you can do get queries. And you can see here that it's bringing back Megan Bowen. Now, I clearly am not Megan Bowen, but what Microsoft has done is, without even signing into a tenancy, they've provided a demo tenant that you can start poking around with. And this is populated with email messages and calendar entries, so you can get a feel for the graph without logging into any tenancy at all. And that is totally safe to do that.
Great stuff, Cam. One other question too. Is there a way to show a calendar of events in a traditional calendar month view, like the old SharePoint calendar list view?
Good question. I don't believe the Graph Toolkit includes a calendar style view yet. I may be wrong because it's changing all the time, but that Graph Toolkit playground would be the place to go to try to answer that question. I can try to answer that on the fly here for us if I go to the Graph Toolkit playground. And if I go to, yes, we're inside the agenda component here, and if we go and have a look at the docs for it, let's see the different views that it allows for us. Properties, show max, I don't think it does. Here's a lot of the styles that we can override, get by date, get by week, but no, it doesn't look like it's got that traditional stick on your fridge type calendar, unfortunately, but maybe it's in the works.
Yeah, great. And the final question there from Jeremy, how confident do you feel about using MGT in real world applications?
Look, I think I'd feel as confident as I would getting a developer to develop the equivalent functionality. Put it that way, like if a toolkit component exists to go and fetch the data, I can see what it's doing under the covers. As we saw on that network tab where we could see this polling was going out, and we could see the query that was being executed, you can see the data that's going out, and it's doing what a developer would have to write themselves. But there's a lot that's gone into these components from an accessibility point of view, from testing across different browsers and sort of operating systems. If you had to develop that yourself, you'd have to question how much confidence have you got in your developers to be able to come up with something that's as good as what this Microsoft team has been able to come up with in all the different aspects of it. And as I say, so I would feel, in answering that question, I'd feel very confident using these components, and especially the one that I absolutely love is the login component. Even if you didn't use any of their other components, just use it to get that login. That is going to save you weeks, if not months, trying to understand all the complexities of security. And that's one thing that developers, like if people are just starting to get used to a technology, the component you do not want them building as their first component is security, doing a login and making sure the whole thing's secure and they're not leaking user credentials and making sure everything's secure. Just outsource that one bit. Even if you just drop back and use the Graph SDK for the rest of your application, do the login one using the Graph Toolkit. So yeah, I'd be very confident in using it, and that's part of why I pointed out those lock-in aspects, because you can always drop back, and that's the bit I love about the Graph Toolkit, is that it's designed so that you can drop back. So if the functionality you need is not there through the Graph Toolkit components, drop back to the SDK, and in fact you can drop back one level further and hit the graph itself. But it's all the plumbing's already set up for you, so it's really, really powerful.
Fantastic, great session there, Cam. And look, for anyone else who wants to connect again with Cam, here's his details up on the screen. So yeah, do shift on over to the LinkedIn group and continue your questions there, and look forward to seeing his video too on the YouTube channel too, if you need to share that with friends or watch again. Thanks again, Cam. That was fantastic.
All right. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Bye for now.